Chapter 6 and 7. Chapter 6. The Haunted Melon Patch. Evidently, Mrs. Dowdle always had extra trouble in the fall of the year. Nameless figures were known to sneak down behind the houses to her patch and swipe her melons. It was kind of a local tradition. Dating couples had been flushed out of this same location. The town knew Mrs. Dowdle was armed and dangerous, but high school kids would figure that trying to steal a half-ripe watermelon was worth the risk of getting your head blown off. Even after her long days, Mrs. Dowdle sat guard down there. You could see her on sentry duty from her back porch. She made herself pretty comfortable. There was a nip in the air now, but she put together a little stove from cinder blocks and an oven rack. A pot of camp coffee brewed on the grill. She buried baking potatoes under the fire. There she hunkered on 2 overturned pails in a cap with flaps and 3 or 4 Afghans. Her melons and squash were coming on. Behind her on the vines, climbing the cob house, her gourds were ready. And so was she. The Winchester was always across her big knees, unless she was cleaning it by firelight. Maybe sitting out in the hazy night watching the sparks rise to join the stars gave Mrs. Dowdle ideas. Maybe she even saw weird visions in the firelight's flicker. Who knows? A rumor about that particular melon patch began to drift through town. At first, it wasn't louder than the whisper of dry leaves. A word here, a word there. It could have come from anywhere. And then it broke into print in the county seat newspaper. A column called News from Our Outlying Communities appeared in the Piatt County Call, which is their local newspaper. Strange sightings in rural vicinity. According to Mrs. Dowdle, a lifelong resident, there is no truth to the story making the rounds of one of our smaller villages. In a melon patch at the rear of the Dowdle property, the rumor reports that an unexplained presence has been sighted by various intruders in the dark of night. Young couples have fled the patch in terror, leaving behind half-empty bottles of Thunderbird wine, picnic blankets, and several transistor radios. Horse feathers, Mrs. Dowdle is quoted as saying, or a similar word. I ain't seen a thing out of the ordinary, and I'm in my patch nearly every night to discourage the juvenile delinquents who's taken over the town. However, the elderly landowner admitted that her property and outbuildings are built over an ancient Kickapoo burial ground. Oh, pshaw, Mrs. Dowdle expostulated. As kids, we were forever digging up arrowheads and calabashes and all them ancient relics. Beadwork and such stuff. Once in a great while, a skull would surface or a dog would dig up something. And the unexplained presence? Some used to say they'd seen the ghost of a girl in a feathered headdress and moccasins. Mrs. Dowdle recalled, you know how people talk. They called her the Kickapoo Princess. When our reporter inquired if she'd ever seen the ghostly Kickapoo Princess herself, the aged matron replied, Me? I got enough aggravation from the living without messing with the dead. Asked for a final word on the subject, Mrs. Dowdle said, Keep off my property. You know who you are. The next ghost you see could be you. After this news broke, the rumor of spooky doings in the melon patch spread far out into the county. A steady line of cars and trucks edged along our street every evening, bumper to bumper. People craned their necks for a glimpse of anything they could see. Flash bulbs popped from back seats. Mrs. Dowdle's cob house blocked most of the view, but people could see the glow of her campfire like an eerie halo above. You children, Mother said in a weary voice, you keep completely out of this. Where's Ruth Ann? In a day or two, the police chief and the newspaper were swamped with reports of strange lights in the night and sudden sounds. We Barnharts were used to sudden sounds by now. It was hunting season, at least in Mrs. Dowdle's mind. Pintails, mallards, teals, the first of the migrating Canada geese, often flapped their last over her property. Any time before dark, we were apt to hear the full voice of a 12-gauge shotgun. Then somebody on the wing would stop short in the sky and drop like a rock. And whether it was actually pheasant season or not, it was Too late to warn the pheasant. Another week or so, and rumors of the ghost princess began to blend with last year's big news. People remembered how the Russians had sent their own Sputnik rockets into orbit, one with a dog riding in it. This brought back the topic of flying saucers. Mrs. L.J. Wiedenbach, the banker's wife, granted an interview with the Piatt County Call. She spoke for the membership of the Daughters of the American Revolution, saying, "The Russians are perfectly capable of disguising one of their spies as a ghost of an Indian princess, or anything else of either sex, not to mention a flying dog. The enemy is already among us. We're probably radioactive already. We must keep our eyes peeled and support our troops." Over on the high school side, the kids were abuzz. They'd all trespassed on the haunted melon patch at one time or another, but nobody could finger the couples who'd left the Thunderbird wine and picnic blankets and transistor radios behind when the Kickapoo princess scared them off. A few began to remember they'd seen something they couldn't put a name to at the melon patch. They milled in the school halls and couldn't settle it. Test scores dropped. A Boy Scout troop working toward Eagles said there ought to be a badge for ghost spotting. The whole matter might have died down with football season and corn husking and high school homecoming on the way. But things took another turn on a certain moonless night. And it wasn't Boy Scouts. It was girls. A bunch of them. I slept through most of it up till the screaming and the gunfire. But by daybreak, the whole town had all the particulars. Though high school sororities weren't allowed, there was one, run by a redhead named Juanetta Blaylock. Her mother had been a Lovejoy, and they owned the hybrid seed corn and the grain elevator. The sorority was Iota Nu Beta, which some people said stood for I ought to know better. This was the time of year Iota Nu Beta initiated new freshman girls. Not Phyllis. She said herself she wasn't eligible since she couldn't wear makeup and only had 2 skirts. Juanetta had said all over school that Phyllis was as poor as a church mouse and anyhow not from here. Even down in the grades, we heard all about the plans for a secret Iota Nu Beta initiation. Juanetta personally leaked word that it would take place in the vicinity of the haunted melon patch. On that moonless Friday night, according to eyewitnesses, the Iota Nu Beta girls met out behind our house by our car. We had a car. We just didn't have gas money for it, and it burned a quart of oil if you hit the starter. It was a 1950 Nash 4-door. We called it the Pickle because of its shape, and also it was green. From over by the parked Pickle, the sorority girls could see across the canvas. There Mrs. Dowdle slumped asleep before her dying fire. Out there on a flat ground, she must have looked like the Rock of Gibraltar. Her shotgun lay broken open and was beginning to slip off her knees. The scene was silent as the grave, except for a little ground wind rattling the gourd vine against the cob house. The first girl to be initiated, first and last, was Barbara Jean Jeter. She wore baby doll shorty pajamas and spoolie plastic curlers. She had to crawl out in the patch, steal a squash within range of Mrs. Dowdle, and crawl back. The other part of the initiation, to eat a lard sandwich and recite a dirty limerick, was slated for later back at Juanetta's house. Edna Earl Stubbs and Vanette Pankey, the sorority sergeant-at-arms, gave Barbara Jean a kick to start her out. Even if she didn't believe in ghosts, she had to believe in Mrs. Dowdle's shotgun. So she belly crawled low, and it would have been pretty dank down in that sandy soil for a girl dressed in as little as Barbara Jean was. But freshmen will do anything to belong. Barbara Jean crept on from melon to melon, from squash to squash. At this point, eyewitness reports differ. Vanette Pankey said that even from the Pickle she heard a sound, a rattle of dried beans in a gourd. Edna Earl Stubbs said no. The first sound was the distant drumbeat, very far off. Boom, 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 like that. Anyway, it didn't wake Mrs. Dowdle. Then we come to some real confusion. Firelight played against the cob house wall. The gourd vine cast fluttering shadows. Juanetta herself said she was the first to see somebody or something standing there, the vines grown up around her, some creature of the night or history, not quite life-size, but definitely there. Another sorority girl said no. The first sighting of the ghost was right up by Mrs. Dowdle, like she had just stepped out from behind her, or floated, with firelight on its face. Wrong, Edna Earle said. She clearly saw the Kickapoo princess descending from a great height, probably heaven or the happy hunting ground. Edna Earle saw a pair of beaded moccasins dangling a good 6 feet above the ground, maybe higher. They were all scared, too speechless to warn Barbara Jean. But they all agreed on one point. The Kickapoo princess was wearing a full feathered headdress and carried a pair of gourd rattles in her weirdly pale little hands, and they all said her hair was in braids. Anyway, here came Barbara Jean through the melons, working along on her elbows. She was within reach of the dying fire and spotting for squash when she heard something or saw something. She jumped up before she thought, stumbled, and fell back, and then sat down hard. Everybody over by the pickle heard a snapping sound. Barbara Jean sent up a scream that tore the night in two. "Help!" she screamed. "I've been grabbed. The ghost is dragging me with her into the grave. Save me!" Barbara Jean was heard uptown. She certainly brought Mrs. Dowdle around. She vaulted out of her deep sleep, and her pails went over behind her. She fished 2 shells out of her apron and fed them into the shotgun. Shouldering the butt of the gun into her afghans, she swung wildly. "Hold your fire," Barbara Jean screamed. "I'm already half buried, and the ghost is biting me right on my—" Kaboom! Kaboom! Mrs. Dowdle fired twice. A tongue of red flame from each barrel licked the night. People all over the township called the chief of police. Barbara Jean's screams knocked me out of bed. Then the gunplay. When I came out of my room, the door to Phyllis and Ruth Ann's was closed. How could they sleep through this? I wondered. Downstairs, Mother and Dad were on the back porch wearing blankets. The pickle stood alone. Seeing a sorority sister in dire danger, the Iota Nu Betas had all hightailed it home to save their own skins. As president, Wynetta Bladelock was no doubt in the lead. Mrs. Dowdle had already released Barbara Jean from the steel jaws of a spring-action rabbit trap, which had a good firm hold on her where it hurts the most. Now the red light on the police chief's Dodge lit up everything. There was enough light to explain any unexplained presence. Mrs. Dowdle stood with one hand on her hip and the shotgun in the crook of her other arm. She'd raised one flap on her cap to hear what Police Chief C.P. Snokes had to say. He was as well armed as she was, but she could outdraw him. "Doggone it, Mrs. Dowdle, discharging a firearm within the city limits is a crime." "So's trespassing." Mrs. Dowdle nodded down at Barbara Jean, still sprawled among the melons. "Anyhow, who says we're inside the city limits?" A crowd was gathering out at the edge of the light, people from all around the neighborhood in the darndest array of sleepwear you ever saw. "The county surveyor says so," C.P. Snokes said. "You know yourself the city limits is that woven wire fence that runs along the west side of your property." "Do tell," Mrs. Dowdle poked at her fire with a big shoe. "You talking white man's law? I'd say this ancient Kickapoo burial ground was here long before the first so-called pioneers." C.P. Snokes scratched up under his cap. "Mrs. Dowdle, are you telling me you live on an Indian I reserve the right to protect my property, is what I'm telling you. Run that gal in," Mrs. Dowdle said. "Read her rights and book her like they do on television." C.P. Snokes' flashlight revealed a no-nonsense, heavy-duty, patented rabbit trap nearby Barbara Jean. "That's a mean-looking rabbit trap," C.P. Snokes said. "But legal," Mrs. Dowdle said. "Did you catch many rabbits?" "I caught one tonight," she said. "Looks like a snowshoe hare." Sure enough, in the flashlight's beam, Barbara Jean looked a lot like a scared white rabbit in plastic hair curlers and shorty pajamas. Her eyes were pink in the glare. Her nose twitched, though she was still too scared to cry. C.P. Snokes got a good look at her. "Doggone it, I can't run her in." "How come?" "She's the Jeter girl. That's the doctor's daughter. And her mama was a—" I know what her mama was, Mrs. Dowdle said. Tell her to keep her gal home at night. My motto is ready, fire, aim. Keep that in mind. Next time there won't be enough of her left to initiate. That pretty well rounded out the night. C.P. Snokes put Barbara Jean in his Dodge. Now she was crying buckets, though he was only taking her home to the Jeters out on the Laplace Road. The seat of her shorty pajamas hung in tatters. Barbara Jean was crying her eyes out, but she had a good grip on a medium-sized acorn squash. Mrs. Dowdle kicked ashes on her embers and went on up to the house, the Winchester over her arm. In these last hours before dawn, the town tried to settle. I couldn't, and I was still wide awake to hear a stealthy foot on the stairs. I peered out of my room just as Phyllis's form vanished into hers. I followed. She nearly jumped over the bed when I turned up there on her heels. Still, she had the sense not to scream. The envelope to a letter she was writing to Elvis Presley was on her table. Private Elvis Presley, A Company, 1st Medium Tank Battalion, 32nd Regiment, Fort Hood, Texas. She moved between me and it, but I had reason to know she signed all the letters to Elvis. Love me tender, Phyllis. Ruth Ann slept with a nightlight. The Elvises loomed over her. The Elvis over Phyllis's bed glowed in the dark. It was from the Jailhouse Rock movie. Close that door, Phyllis whispered at me. What are you doing up at this? The whole town's up, I whispered back. Big doings in the melon patch. Haunts, gunfire, sorority girls, the law. You can't hear yourself think. We thought you went to bed early. I did, Phyllis said, somewhat shifty. Then I got up, and I went on a hayride. I thought the future farmer's hayride was next weekend. It is, Phyllis whispered, not looking me in the eye. There were little bits of straw and hay all over her, from her barrettes to her penny loafers. Her rolled-up jeans were dusty with chaff. Mother and Dad didn't know you sneaked out, I accused. I didn't sneak out, she said. I left quietly. I'm 14. I have a life to live. In many important ways, I'm practically 20. Oh, I said. And clear out of my room, Phyllis whispered. It loomed pink around us. Ruth Ann will wake up, and it'll be your fault. We glanced across the pink stripe to Ruth Ann's side. She was this little mound in bed, snoring lightly with one small hand on top of the covers, a drying hollyhock doll nestled by her chin. For Pete's sakes, Phyllis murmured, what are those feathers doing all around her bed? It looks like a pheasant flew in here and blew up. Feathers by her bed. I wonder what that is. Chapter 7, Fuss and Feathers. The town was all eyes and ears, and the countryside heard all about it. The Kickapoo Princess had gone overnight from rumor to a sure thing. Being high school girls, the witnesses weren't reliable, but there was a bunch of them, and they sang like canaries. It was a story that had everything: ghosts, gunplay, and civil defense. What's going on in rural Piatt County melon patch? Was a headline in the Champaign Courier. Are our distant early warning defense systems enough? People who couldn't find us on the map beat a path to our door. Traffic backed up, and the newspapers of Arcola, Sullivan, and DeWitt County sent reporters. Woody's Zephyr oil filling station pumped gas around the clock. The Dairy Queen took an extra help and was talking about putting in a drive-through. A lot of money changed hands. Barbara Jean Jeter's mother kept her out of school for a week, saying she had a beast of a cold and possibly bronchitis. To cash in, Mrs. Dowdle set up shop out in the front of her property. It was a roadside stand featuring her jars of corn relish and apple butter and everything else of her storm cellar. Piles of jars stood on hay bales, though she had no hay to bale. There were bunches of bittersweet tied with fishing line. Shocks of Indian corn rose out of the pumpkin piles. A few gawky dolls made out of corn husks and yarn with walnuts for faces. A sign over a mountain of watermelon and muskmelon read, "Produce from the haunted patch. You plug 'em, you bought 'em." Coffee cans held displays of pheasant feathers. Authentic Kickapoo headdress feathers, 5 cents apiece or 3 for a dime. Mrs. Dowdle's prices were steep, but she was making money hand over fist. Also, she was unusually chatty to reporters who wanted to interview her. though they had to buy a gallon jug of soft cider or a peck of peaches first. You could hear her from our house bending the reporter's ear. Pshaw, if you're after a story, go down to the southern part of the state, down there at Cahokia. I know it's the rough end of creation, but the old prehistoric people buried their folks in mounds down there. Good many had been dug up and put on display. Bones, of course. Go on down there and don't bother me, she'd say, and keep the change. A small figure joined her after school, waiting on trade and darting back and forth for more gourds off the haunted vine at a dime apiece, a quarter for 3. It was Ruth Ann, in a cut-down version of Mrs. Dowdle's feed-sack apron with pockets. Mother kind of gave up and said, well, at least I know where she is, and she doesn't have to cross a busy street. To work on his sermons, Dad had to move up in the attic. The traffic was deafening, and the cars parked in our front yard. Ruth Ann only came home in time for supper, bobbing through the cannas in an apron that brushed her sandals. She never came home empty-handed. She'd bring a mess of tomatoes too bruised to sell, or a long-necked squash Mother could fry in butter. Now Ruth Ann was tying up her braids at the back of her head, since most of Mrs. Dowdle's hair was drawn back in a big bun. Ruth Ann carried a corn dolly in her apron pocket now that the hollyhocks were over. If you ask me, she was turning into Mrs. Dowdle's doll herself. Mother tried to have little talks with her. Honey, you're a good little helper, bless your heart, but try to remember, Mrs. Dowdle is old and can get confused in the things she says. Pshaw, Ruth Ann would say back. This whole town is built where 2 old Indian trails cross. The Kickapoos going one way and the Illini the other. Ooh boy, no wonder there's restless spirits underfoot. Then she'd poke at the bridge of her nose like she wore spectacles. Mother sighed. Mrs. Dowdle turned a tidy profit. Her apron got so saggy with loose change that she had to hang a berry pail from an Army surplus ammo belt slung around her big middle. Another rumor began to drift through town. Lacey liked the smoke off the burning leaves. You could probably have traced it back to Mrs. Dowdle herself. It was common knowledge that she didn't trust banks, especially the Wiedenbach's bank uptown. Still, she was spotted at the teller's counter, picking up those papers you roll piles of quarters in. The bank gave them free. She was said to have folding money in stacks, too, stacks and stacks. The exact amount grew in the telling. Her front room light burned late as she sat counting it, several said. Rumor reported that she was stashing her treasure somewhere in her house. A loose floorboard in her grandson's old bedroom was mentioned, Joey's room. But witnesses were on the record that she'd been digging out in her melon patch in the darkest of night. Who knew? Finally, Mrs. Dowdle had sold every melon and squash in her patch and every gourd off her vine, and all at top dollar. Her tomato plants were picked clean and ready to be dug under. The pheasant feathers had sold like hotcakes. They'd flown out of those coffee cans. She'd feathered her nest for sure. Now you'd think she'd be hunkering down for winter and maybe paying to have her kindling split. But no. She turned up at our kitchen door one night, a heavy clump on the porch, a thundering rap on the door, and there she was. From the table we saw the 2 moons of her specks agleam in the gloom. We jumped. Supper was just over, and Phyllis was plotting her escape. Ruth Ann went to open the door, and we followed. And then we saw that she wasn't alone. An eerie face under a mashed hat peered around her. Cross-eyed peered at us and everywhere else through a veil. It was Mrs. Wilcox of the Washfoot Church. Mrs. Dowdle leaned toward Mother and muttered. I couldn't shake her. She jerked a thumb to indicate Mrs. Wilcox. She's all over me like a rubber girdle in a heat wave. Oh, but you're both as welcome as you can be, Mother said. Come in and take chairs. But that wasn't going to happen. They came in, though, single file. They were paying a call, so they had on their best aprons with rickrack. Mrs. Wilcox's eyes and teeth went in every direction. Something bulky hung in the crook of Mrs. Dowdle's arm. Not her Winchester. It was a box, a little bigger than a shoebox. Phyllis held back, trying not to be there. Ruth Ann and I were the only ones who'd seen Mrs. Dowdle this close, and I wasn't admitting it. But she looked straight over my head like she'd never set eyes on me in her life. Ruth Ann's apron was just like hers and Mrs. Wilcox. Phyllis was drifting further off. "I don't, neighbor," Mrs. Dowdle announced, though she was handing Mother her last jar of pickled peaches. "She don't," Mrs. Wilcox piped up. "I'm here strictly on church business." "Strictly business," Mrs. Wilcox echoed, "and no funny business." Mrs. Dowdle turned on Dad, who was fighting his way into a suit coat. "You can't get a church up and going without a good funeral first," she told him. "Any fool could tell you that without a funeral, you ain't got a chance in the world," Mrs. Wilcox said. "I haven't missed a funeral since the great flu epidemic. A good funeral makes the whole week go better." "I want me one," Mrs. Dowdle said. A grave silence fell over us. Was she talking about her own funeral? Was she planning ahead? Dad looked lost. "And the departed?" he asked, feeling his way. "Oh, well, shoot," Mrs. Dowdle said, expostulated. "I brought her with me." Did she mean Mrs. Wilcox? Mrs. Wilcox stood there in Mrs. Dowdle's big shadow. A toothpick wavered out between two of her teeth. She didn't look ready to depart, quite. But Mrs. Dowdle was sliding the box out of the crook of her arm. It was wrapped in a piece of old rug or an Indian blanket, something ragged and sewed together with thongs. It was roped around, and there was some beadwork stuck on. "I'm sick to death of all this fussin' and fumin' about restless spirits and floatin' princesses and all such horse feathers," Mrs. Wilcox said. "That's right, Mrs. Dowdle's fixin' to get down to the end of her rope, and you don't want to rile her. She's about a squat jump away from—" "I'll tell it, Effie," Mrs. Dowdle said. "I'm up to here with juvenile delinquent sorority girls and riffraff come from town trampling on my property like they own it. This used to be a nice, quiet little town. Now look at it." "Just look," Mrs. Wilcox said. Dad said. "So I dug her up," Mrs. Dowdle said. "The so-called Kickapoo Princess. And here she is." She handed the box over, and it was in Dad's hands before he knew it. We stood there stunned. Mother went snow white. Phyllis just went. Ruth Ann was all eyes. She poked at the bridge of her nose like she was wearing spectacles. "This is all I could find of her, and it's not much more than eye teeth and gristle. But then she's been pushing up my melons for a good many years," Mrs. Dowdle said. "She wasn't nothing but a bag of bones even before I was born, and I'm as old as dirt." "Older," Mrs. Wilcox murmured. "I want a good church funeral for her so the public will know that she's not adrift in the back of my place, and I want her buried in the cemetery along with everybody else." She was turning to go now and shooing Mrs. Wilcox to the door. "Do your best, preacher," she said over her massive shoulder, "and do it up big. I'll get the word out. You get the lead out." And then they were gone. "Night now," Mrs. Wilcox called back out of the evening. Dad stood there with all that remained of the Kickapoo Princess. "I'm not a showman, Ellen," he said at last to Mother, "and I'm no gypsy pigot. It sounds like they won't want a funeral. They want a show." "You'll know what to do, Jack," Mother said. "You'll rise to the occasion. This may just be a heaven-sent opportunity for you." She looked fairly sure, though it was hard to picture Mrs. Dowdle as a messenger from heaven. But Mother may already have been thinking about sheet music and a choir. She'd met Dad when he was in the choir and he was in his first pulpit. You could almost hear hymns humming in her head. Dad jiggled the box. The label on the blanket around it read, "Made in the USA, Pendleton, Oregon." "I don't think there's much of anything in this box," Dad said. "Or anybody." "Maybe she's there in spirit," Mother said. "Or maybe Mrs. Dowdle dreamed her up out of thin air," Dad said. "I'm not sure the truth is always in her." But then they both noticed Ruth Ann right below them, all ears and as innocent as if she'd never worn a feathered headdress in all of her 6 years.